HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Black Heart Fades Blue, Volume 3, by Jerry A. Lang, read by David Vries. 1. The drug spiral had gone on long enough. It was music that had been my first love, and I longed for the day it would again come first. Before I move this story along to my battle with addiction, I want to talk about my other bands. Over the years, there have been a lot of good bands in Portland that are today long forgotten. I played in more than a dozen bands myself, and I think a few of them were pretty good. There was Jungle Nausea, which was sort of like the Contortions but a little more tribal, like Bow Wow Wow. I actually got kicked out of that band. I was tripping during a show at the Clinton Street Theater and people were throwing ice cubes at me. My eyes were spinning in my head at that show, and the rest of the band decided they didn't want to put up with my problems anymore. They'd had enough. Another one of my short-lived bands was called The Sids. The name was kind of a play on both the many Sid Vicious wannabes and sudden infant death syndrome. I could imagine a music critic describing us as being angular. All I know is that it was a fun group to play in. We'd improv songs and make up lyrics like car crash, black sky, busted light, based on things we were seeing before our eyes. In addition to those bands, I've done time in Smegma, The Kinetics, The Stand, Piss Wild Horses, SWAT, Gumby Antichrist, and Gift. I've collaborated with Dare to Defy, Killer of Sheep, Anti-Scene, 25th Coming 5, Jenny Don't in the Spurs, The Phantom Notes, The Ransoms, and Decimation Front. I've practiced with some bands when I was down in San Francisco that I never joined, including Bad Posture. I've been a one-time Elvis impersonator. I've performed with the Hard-Ons, Big Stick, Brad Boatwright, the Nightbirds, and the Eyelids. There have been a few projects that didn't quite work out. For instance, Jeff Dahl from the Angry Samoans came and made a record with the band. I think he might have stayed with Tom for a few days, though I'm not sure. I was supposed to go in the studio with Jeff and the band and cover some Dead Boys songs, but things kept getting in the way, namely my drug habit. So I did miss out on that experience, unfortunately, and it wasn't the only missed opportunity. Recently, there's been talk of collaborating on something with Paul Bearer from Sheer Terror. I think that could be interesting. Yes, Poison Idea is my main group, the one I poured my heart and soul into, but I've enjoyed other musical alliances and experiences. Many bands are lost to history. That said, quite a few local bands broke out in the 90s and 2000s, and they kind of put Portland on the map. Some broke big, and probably contributed to putting the city on the hipster trail, along with places like Brooklyn, Austin, and San Francisco. Some of these bands I like and some not so much, but I know lots of stories. As I'm writing this book, I have a podcast that I do every Friday morning on House of Sound, a cool freeform non-profit radio station that advertises as being Portland's only uncensored radio. I've thought about telling some of those stories on internet radio, but haven't yet. Here's just one example. There's a big local rock star who is a compulsive liar. I'll protect his identity here. I know a guy who went on tour with his band as part of the road crew. They were playing a big arena, and backstage, one member of the road crew began talking about what it was like when he lived in South Central L.A., how it was such a dangerous neighborhood. Then he related a wild story about a huge gas leak. It was so big that it blew out every window in the immediate vicinity, and it killed a guy by blowing his head clean off his body. The head was found 4 blocks away. The big rock star listened intently as the story was being told, then he did his sound check and left for a meal break. A few hours later, he's back in the dressing room talking to the road crew and part of his inner circle and maybe a few fans who had gotten backstage, and he says, "Did I ever tell any of you about the time when I lived in South Central?" And then he proceeded to tell the roadie story word for word as if it were his own. The crew kind of laughed along nervously at first. They thought he was just fucking around and would acknowledge the source, but he never did. and they began to realize he believed what he was saying. He was just plain crazy. How was P.I. doing at this time? Well, when the crazy rock star was lying his ass off and playing coliseums, I got a royalty check from Italy. It turned out that some band I had never heard of had covered one of our songs. How much was it for? I think it was $1.51. It wasn't even worth cashing. Like I had told Wurzel from Motorhead, we weren't getting rich doing this. By chance, the day it arrived, I got a mail order request from some kid who wrote that he was a big fan. When I filled his order, I enclosed the royalty check, thinking it might be a cool souvenir for someone who really liked the band. I'd sometimes do that, if I had something cool lying around that would be a unique memento. It might be a cut-and-paste collage I had made, or a postcard of Black Bart with one of his bandit poems, or an old show flyer of, say, a Scratch Acid/Hell Cow show that definitely had some history. Whatever was handy. I try to imagine what it might be like for me to get a relic like that from, say, Johnny Cash or the Kinks. 2. Japan. I made a brief allusion to Japan earlier in this tale of woe, but I didn't say much about it, so why not here? I got clued into Japanese hardcore pretty early on. Tom and I knew of some of the older punk and new wave bands like the Stalin and the Plastics, who had even toured the U.S. and performed on American TV. But then we started hearing early hardcore, plus more experimental noise bands like Hijo Kaidan, Hanatarashi, and Merzbow. Pretty extreme stuff. The music would come to us from many sources. I think Pusshead turned us on to some of the bands. The underground was a small world unto itself. Tom and I each had the ultra-rare Flexi single by State Children, a head-peeling record that would sound like utter noise to almost everyone, but which is worth a small fortune today. By that point, we had begun keeping our ears pointed to Japan. They didn't influence us and we didn't influence them, but we appreciated what they were doing. You could hear some influences, like early Discharge in Japcore. But it really was its own unique thing. People from other scenes have told me that punks in Portland were more up on what was going on in Japan. Maybe geography had something to do with it. Portland is almost exactly the same distance from London and Tokyo. Actually, I think we're about 75 miles closer to Tokyo. Sure, bands everywhere build on inspirations and influences. This is true from Des Moines, Iowa to Dunedin, New Zealand. But we tried to make it our own and put our own stamp on it. There were other international punk scenes we followed. There were a lot of good bands in Italy, Norway, and Sweden, for example. Tom was also fond of the German and Dutch scenes. I was more into the Finnish stuff and was especially big on the band Llama. But as a scene, Japan stood out. The most extreme stuff sounded pretty ferocious. By comparison, I always thought our music was more melodic and structured. Of the first wave of punk bands, the Stalin was my favorite. The singer was a guy named Michiro Endo, who seemed pretty unique. He was a lot older, and he had lived a full life before punk rock. He would later become a kind of a folky punk troubadour, maybe Bob Dylan-like in some ways. He had something to do with a fanzine called Ingo. Yes, occasionally Japanese music magazines would make their way to Portland, and we liked looking through them even if we couldn't read the language. Doll was a popular one. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Our favorite Japanese hardcore band was Gizm, whose name was an acronym with many different meanings. I didn't really get it at first. They were too metal for my taste, but I would come around. They were so extreme. They were talented musicians, and by all accounts their live shows were dangerous. They made a strong impression. Their singer, Sakevi, made noise collages and put out magazines like POW that were like works of art. He was also known for being a legendary fighter. Occasionally there would be a musician with a reputation. People in L.A. used to talk about John Macias that way. A guy not to be messed with. Sakevi had that reputation in Tokyo. Because of our long-standing interest, Tom and I had wanted to play shows in Japan. Tom was a big-time tape trader, and people would send him mixtapes of Japcore that also included Japanese metal and 60s GS, or group sounds bands. So we were up on some of that stuff. That was kind of how it was with Australia, too. It was a primitive social network. Though our fascination with Japanese music was at its zenith in the 80s and early 90s, I kept up a little bit. A friend of mine in NYC would go to Japan often, and he'd send me fanzines, albums, flyers, and movies. He'd usually bring back copies of Burst magazine, which was kind of similar to the British subculture magazine Bazaar. Through him, I'd find out the latest news. For instance, we were talking about the band Inu one time, and I learned that the singer had become a novelist who had won major literary awards. You know, I probably wanted to go to Japan when I first saw Japanese imports of Kiss records when I was a kid. That's probably where it started. Some records had cool-looking obi strips along the side, and some albums by American and British bands might have had an extra track or two for the Japanese audience, which made them a prized possession for fans in the States. Cheap Trick made a famous live album recorded at Budokan. And I remember seeing photos of the Runaways, who were treated like big stars in Japan when they were barely known in America. There was also a connection between Japan and the no-wave scene in New York. Japanese musicians had been in DNA and Teenage Jesus and the Jerks. One of them had returned to Japan and started a cool band called Friction. So although we were all strung out on dope, we booked a tour of Japan. I had seen enough Japanese gangster movies that I figured I could go into some sleazy punk bar and buy enough dope to take care of me for the entire tour. In preparation, I did a large amount before I flew out of Portland. Not enough to OD, but more than enough to keep me well for the half-day flight. Dope has legs, so I didn't get sick right away. I think we played a show the same day we landed, so I just slammed a bottle of Japanese whiskey and did the gig, no problem. But once the drugs were completely out of my system, I had to start putting in some work, pestering everyone who would talk to me, in broken English, asking about heroin. Between the pills that the local kids gave me that had enough opiates in them and copious amounts of booze, I lasted about 2 to 3 days before turning desperate. One of our minders was, well, I'm not going to assume anything, especially in this department, but he was tattooed from the neck all the way down, and his people showed him tremendous respect wherever we went. I do know tattoos are often equated with Yakuza, though I've also heard stories of innocent garage rock people not being allowed to go swimming in a public pool because they have tattoos. There was talk that our handler was a member of a Japanese organized crime gang, but since he never directly told me that himself, I'm not going to assume anything. I got along with him fine, and why shouldn't I? In one major city, I asked around and people told me where to buy drugs. It was down the street from where we were going to play that night. I could even see it from the top floor of the building where the concert was held. But they said it was too dangerous an area. Nobody goes down this street at night. I could see the alley that people had pointed out to me. All I knew was it was the place to buy drugs, but it was considered too dangerous to walk down that street. So I asked our tattooed helper if he knew where I could buy heroin. He said he knew where to get some, but in that town you had to deal with Persians for heroin, and if he were to do that, he'd owe them a big favor. I said no, I would owe him a favor, a big favor for doing this. Thank you for doing this. I'm really grateful. No, he said, he couldn't do it, because then he would owe the Persians a favor. I wondered if I could owe them, the Persians, a favor. Could I? No. We went back and forth for a couple of minutes, and I never could figure out what was going on. It might have sounded like Abbott and Costello's Who's on First routine. Now I can guess the gist of it was if he was going to ask a favor, it better be worth it, and this wasn't. He'd be the one who owed them, and they'd come back to collect on it someday. There were supposedly drugs right down the street, but I had been warned against that. Maybe you couldn't buy them without getting grabbed and sold into slavery or something. Well, that would certainly be an incentive not to ever do dope again. Then again, at the time I was considering that option, I was already a slave to it. What about all those Takashi Miike movies I'd watched, where gangsters run all over slamming dope into every part of their body? Not only gangsters, but schoolgirls and rockers. Dope was so common in these movies. They're fucking movies. I get it now. I was more likely to see Godzilla jump out of the bay than find heroin in Japan. By this point, the promoters and handlers realized that they flew a band over to Japan to perform and make money for them, but the singer was strung out and needed his daily drug allotment. They had all sorts of psychotropic drugs over there, more than any mental patient could swallow, but they wouldn't do shit for me in my condition. These firings in my brain were from another section. The closest thing they could come up with was this stuff called Brawn. It was kind of a cross between Robitussin and codeine cough syrup. At one time, it was full of codeine, but that created an army of degenerates called Brawn bums who would swig the stuff and stay loaded. As my luck would have it, they cut out almost all of the codeine. There was some, maybe 12% or so, enough that if I bought cases of it, spent every yen I had and went to every pharmacy and bought them out, well, then I could almost stay well. I had to drink enough to keep from going into full-blown withdrawal and then start chugging as much Japanese whiskey as I could hold down so that I could halfway function. As a result, even someone like Shane McGowan would have been embarrassed and ashamed by my performances. It wasn't all bad. We met some nice people in every city and played with some great musicians. I can't remember all the bands, but there were guys who had been in Gizm and Deathside, both of whom had been big in the international hardcore scene, plus bands like Melt Banana, who have an international following. There were many bands I had not heard before or since that I enjoyed. We were on some good bills. People ask if we met Gauze, Cobra, Systematic Death, Kuro, S.O.B., The Cums, Lip Cream, Auto, Corrupted, Idora, Aburadako, Kasba, Bastard, etc. Or if we met this garage band or that noise band. Well, we met a lot of people, but I'm not sure of all the connections. In my state, it was kind of hard to keep track. We didn't get to meet a lot of the early bands. Many had broken up. Of course, I got to meet Sakevi. I suppose it was like the meeting of two mob bosses when I went backstage and paid him respect. I joked to a friend that it would be like a scene in The Sopranos where Tony kisses the ring of the boss of bosses, with all our people surrounding us. Poison Idea had covered some Gizm songs, and I wanted him to know how much those records meant to us. Sadly, the guitarist Randy Uchida had passed away from cancer. It would have been great to meet him. One of the oddest moments on tour was when our translator came up to me bleeding profusely. I asked what had happened, but he wouldn't tell me. It would be quite some time before he would open up. To be precise, it took more than a few drinks later in the tour to drag it out of him. It turns out that he had gone backstage after the show. He wound up getting into a conversation with Sakevi. When Sakevi asked him what he thought of his set that night, the translator said something along the lines of, "I've seen better. The old stuff was great, this stuff isn't. You've lost your edge." He then continued to run Sakevi down. "You used to be so violent and dangerous. Look at you now." As he's telling me this, I'm thinking, oh my God, doesn't he know the reputation? He has to know. After taking enough of the translator's insults, Sakevi finally had enough. He must have gone all Mike Tyson on the guy. Pow, pow, a 3 or 4 shot combination splitting the translator's face open. Or maybe it was a headbutt. It was unfortunate it happened, but Sakevi's reaction is understandable after an unprovoked attack of offensive insults. I remember thinking maybe I'd have reacted the same way if I was riding the bus and some stranger came up and started insulting me. The translator should have known better. It was like he was asking for it. You don't poke a bear. Personally, I actually dug a lot of Sakevi's solo stuff as much as the Gizm stuff. It was so cool and extreme. We enjoyed covering Gizm songs like Endless Blockades for the Pussyfooter and Death Agonies and Screams. but I like to solo every bit as much, if not more. The kicker to the story is that the bloodied translator had to go back after getting his ass kicked and bow down and apologize. His insult had violated the Japanese code of conduct, and he had to make public amends. We played with musicians who had been in legendary Japcore bands from the 80s. Again, I don't remember the exact lineage, though I was told about it at the time. I know the sound guy one night had been in a cool band. The owner or manager of a watering hole we visited had been in a band whose songs I knew. It was cool like that. And it happens all over, in Europe and Australia too. Your bartender or the doorman may have written a song that meant a lot to you. Sometimes meeting musicians whose music you like can be disappointing, maybe even most of the time. But in Japan, those experiences were almost all good. After one show, we were told a wealthy fan wanted to take care of our drinks for the night. $1,000 later, we found out that this fan was kind and generous, but not wealthy. Our drinking had cleaned him out. Maybe something had been lost in the translation. Hell, blame it on the translation. Our translator was probably already drunk. Maybe we thought he was the bar owner? Or maybe he never imagined we could drink so much. Still, he made the offer and was stuck with an astronomical bar tab. Whatever the case, I've always wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding and thank him again for his generosity. I could never figure out the Japanese way. The rest of the band was stomping around, refusing to take off their shoes when entering houses. I was going right over their heads. Maybe because I was borderline sober, I think I noticed people hissing at us. I was never straight-out rude, but some people gave me the stink eye about the band not following Japanese customs, taking off shoes, etc. We played with more than a handful of bands who have toured the U.S., and I later saw some snapshots of one of them flashing their asses and flipping off statues, whatever. I don't care, but it seems like a double standard. At one club, the combo of brawn and a liter of whiskey wasn't working too well. I then made the mistake of having a couple rounds of sake after we played. I was sitting at a table feeling like death, and I could feel that sensation in my mouth that could only mean vomit was right behind it. Before I could stand up, everything that was inside me came up, and it hadn't even started to digest. It was straight whiskey. I could have puked it right back into the bottle and no one would have known it came from my stomach. Glasses, pints, quarts, gallons splashed out. An overflowing river of stinking, strong, straight booze. The Japanese person I was with grabbed me by the arm and quickly hustled me out the door. When I got outside, I saw the second handler. He asked what happened. I told him, and he exploded. "You didn't clean it up?" One guy grabs me and runs me out before anyone says anything. The next guy is waiting outside to bitch at me for leaving so quickly. I never figured out what the fuck was going on. I know they greatly value respect and honor. We played a show in the city of Hiroshima. A couple of the promoters took me aside and asked if I would make a speech before our set and apologize for dropping the atomic bomb almost 70 years earlier. I argued that I had nothing to do with that. And while I certainly didn't agree that it should have happened, it was a war, and war is hell, etc. They pushed the issue. Like the Germans who insist on you going back and doing encore after encore just to let you know who is in charge, I felt I had to do this. Hell, maybe they would owe me a favor. Maybe they know some Persians. No such luck. I get up on stage, suck it up, and tell the audience what they all wanted to hear, that I was sorry that someone I didn't know dropped a bomb on other people that I didn't know. There were times when fans would come up to me crying, saying they never thought we'd come to Japan and that they'd never be able to meet me in person. It was humbling and touching, even though I was usually blitzed out of my mind. One young woman saw us a few times. We talked a bit each night, and after the final show, she handed me a long handwritten letter. I promised her I would have it translated and would write back. When I got back to the States, I had a Japanese friend in NYC translate it. Basically, this girl wanted me to know that we were her favorite band and that our songs had helped her get through rough times. I've heard this more than a few times over the years. For instance, I remember a guy coming up to me in front of CBGB's telling me our songs helped him get through prison, and that another friend who was still in the joint was a big PI fan and wanted to say hello. This stuff is always touching, but this was a little different. Though this girl was very hardcore and dressed the part, the letter was written on cutesy Japanese stationery. It was a combination that I found charmingly innocent and genuine. It was a sweet letter. Sadly, I lost the address and never did write. But maybe acknowledging it here is better than nothing? One thing I'd like to do before PI calls it quits is to go back to Japan and play shows sober and at full strength. I'm really kind of embarrassed and disappointed by some of our performances. It still feels like unfinished business. I'd also like to go back so I can see more of the country and maybe learn more about Japanese etiquette and way of life. The night before we left, we went out to get tattoos in a famous tattoo parlor in Tokyo. The shop was known for its high quality and specialized in elaborate dragons, samurai, and Japanese kanji. With all this to choose from, what did I get? I got the word brawn tattooed in Japanese on my right wrist, the Japanese Robitussin. After we were inked up, they paid us what tour money we had made from merchandise, playing live and selling rights to our live recordings for future releases. We got on a plane, bought quarts of duty-free alcohol, and drank until we were met in Portland by airport security and federal marshals. You see, one of us, not me, believe it or not, was handcuffed to a wheelchair and escorted off the plane. I ducked down, pulled my hoodie over my drunken head, and quickly walked off the plane. In my haste, I accidentally wound up leaving my iPod and my baseball hat, which contained all the tour money, in the seat pouch. 3. One of the things I first think of when I remember Japan and other places we have played is the food. Maybe you'd expect this from a guy who once tipped the scales at more than 350 pounds and who played in a band with a guy who once surpassed 1/4 ton, but it's more than that. Around the time I started tightening an early draft of this book, TV foodie and all-around cool guy Anthony Bourdain passed away. I know in my lifetime there are so many people I would have loved to meet. I could make a pretty lengthy list. John Waters, Charles Bukowski, Diamanda Gallas, Andy Kaufman, Lee Bowery, Arthur Lee, Andy Warhol, John Lydon, Bill Hicks, and so on. People with style who followed their own paths. Throw in some old actors like Peter O'Toole and Lee Marvin. People I could imagine hanging out with if the opportunity had presented itself, and if I didn't focus my energy in other directions. Many of these people are gone, and I'll probably never cross paths with those still alive. I'd love to be able to spend a day hanging out with John Waters. I can only imagine that it would be a hoot. If I could meet people who lived before my time, the list would be enormous. Oscar Wilde, W.C. Fields, Buddha, etc. But as for those who shared the earth with me, Anthony Bourdain would have been one of those people. Besides coming off like a down-to-earth guy, his main gig was food. I had a couple of years working in the food industry, and I cooked for my brother and sister when I helped raise them. Whenever I hear people talk about not knowing how to cook, it always blows me away. Prepping a 5-course meal is one thing, but boiling water, toasting bread, and mixing a few ingredients in a bowl is something everyone should know how to do. This was once something they taught in schools. Now they teach students where the escape exits are. Besides wanting to pick Anthony Bourdain's brain about chicken knuckles, I have so many questions he could have answered. Just by describing a dish to him, he could have identified it and cleared up a mystery. Touring with bands over the years, I did my share of having the road crew run out and pick up whatever they could find on the street to keep me going until the next city. But I also put in a decent amount of research and exploring on my own, and then trying things I wasn't sure of. Mystery dishes. In Australia, I was tripping out of my mind on LSD one night, stumbling around. I found this kebab stand with what looked like souvlaki meat on a turning spit. You would order what you want, with or without salad, which in this case pretty much meant lettuce.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?